If there's such a thing as a stereotypical serial killer, Ted Bundy didn't seem to fit the bill. Handsome, intelligent, and charming, Bundy became a rising star in Washington state politics en route to earning an undergraduate degree in psychology and enrolling in law school. It was a package that seemingly made him quite the catch for his female acquaintances. But it was that intelligence and charm that enabled him to reel in his unsuspecting prey and revealed him for what he really was, a sadistic monster. Over a 4-year period in the 1970s, Bundy abducted, bludgeoned, and killed at least 20 women, with dozens more also possibly meeting a gruesome end at his hands. Bundy may not have looked the part, but by the time his reign of terror ended, his name had come to symbolize the worst of the outcasts who seemingly strike at random and leave behind a trail of shattered lives. January 4, 1974. Bundy attacks a University of Washington student. Bundy, then attending the University of Puget Sound's law school, mercilessly beats University of Washington student Karen Sparks at her Seattle home. Sparks becomes one of the few Bundy victims to survive, though she suffers permanent brain damage from the attack. February 1, 1974. Bundy commits his first proven murder. Linda Ann Healy, another UW undergrad, disappears from her off-campus home in the early morning hours, leaving behind a carefully made bed with blood on the pillow. Her remains are found a year later, alongside those of other women, outside Seattle on Taylor Mountain. July 14, 1974. Bundy claims 2 victims on the same day. 2 college students, Janice Ott and Denise Mashand, vanished from the Seattle area's Lake Sammamish State Park within a 3-hour time frame. Witnesses recall a young man named Ted, his arm in a sling, asking the women for help carrying his boat. His description matches that of the injured, Ted, seen at nearby schools from which several female students had gone missing. Many of these young women shared a notable physical characteristic: long hair parted in the middle. August 30, 1974. The law student moves to Utah. Leaving his job at the Emergency Services Department in Olympia, Washington, Bundy heads to Salt Lake City to resume his studies at the University of Utah Law School. November 8, 1974. Bundy strikes twice in one day, again. Posing as a police officer in Murray, Utah, Bundy lures 18-year-old Carol DeRange from a mall to his tan Volkswagen Beetle, where he attempts to apply handcuffs before she escapes. Later that day, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappears after leaving a high school play to pick up her younger brother. Investigators find a key in the school parking lot that fits the handcuffs used on DeRange. January 12, 1975. The killer surfaces in Colorado. A 23-year-old nurse named Karen Campbell disappears from her hotel in Snowmass, Colorado, after leaving the lobby to retrieve a magazine from her room. Her body is found a few weeks later in a snowbank outside the resort village. August 16, 1975. Bundy is briefly apprehended. Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward stops a tan Volkswagen Beetle that had been lingering outside a home. Hayward arrests the shaggy-haired driver after finding a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, and handcuffs in the car. But charges of evading police aren't enough to keep him detained for long, and Bundy is soon released. October 2, 1975. Bundy is selected from a police lineup. Although previous efforts to identify Bundy had failed, DeRange and 2 other women point him out in a police lineup. He is arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping. March 1, 1976. Bundy is convicted for his abduction efforts. Following a 5-day trial, during which he waived the right to be heard by a jury, Bundy is found guilty of aggravated kidnapping, drawing a 1 to 15-year prison sentence. October 21, 1976. Bundy is charged with first-degree murder. Investigators link Bundy to the January 1975 death of Campbell through the discovery of her hair in his car, the use of his gasoline credit card in the vicinity the day she disappeared, and eyewitness accounts of him being at her hotel. He is extradited to Aspen, Colorado, in early 1977 to stand trial. June 7, 1977. Bundy escapes from a library. Allowed access to the law library at Aspen's Pitkin County Courthouse, an unshackled and unguarded Bundy leaps from a second-floor window and heads into the mountains. Following a 6-day manhunt, he is found driving a stolen car and returned to custody. December 30, 1977. A slimmed-down Bundy disappears from his prison cell. Moved to an allegedly more secure facility in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, Bundy loses enough weight to squeeze through an opening cut through his ceiling and into the duct system. He exits into the empty apartment of a prison worker, changes clothes and escapes once again, this time leaving Colorado behind and eventually winding up in northern Florida. January 15, 1978. Bundy kills 2 students and injures 3 more in Florida State University. Breaking into FSU's Chi Omega sorority house at around 3 a.m., Bundy strangles the life out of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and beats Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler with a club-like object before fleeing. He then enters another home a few blocks away and brutally assaults another student, Cheryl Thomas. Kleiner, Chandler and Thomas survive their injuries, though none is able to describe the attacker. February 9, 1978. Bundy strikes one more time. 7th grader Kimberly Leach disappears in the middle of the day from Florida's Lake City Junior High School. At 12 years of age, she is significantly younger than Bundy's usual victims. Her body is found 2 months later under a shed in Suwannee River State Park. February 15, 1978. Bundy is apprehended for good. After pulling over a car with its headlights off at 1:30 a.m., and finding the plates to match those of a stolen vehicle, Pensacola police officer David Lee finds himself in a violent scuffle before subduing the driver. Unwilling to give his identity right away, the man eventually reveals himself to be the FBI wanted Bundy. June 25, 1979. Bundy's trial for the Florida rampage begins. The trial, reportedly the first to be televised nationally, commences with jury selection at Miami's Dade County Metro Justice Building. Off the bat, Bundy complains to Judge Edward Coward about the conditions of his prison cell, paving the way for a bizarre month of proceedings, during which he bickers with his counsel, takes the reins to cross-examine a police officer and sits for testimony while referring to himself in the third person. July 18, 1979. Prosecutors focus on Bundy's teeth. Despite defense objections to his testimony being permitted, forensic dentist Richard Suburin compares large photographs of Bundy's teeth to those of the bite marks found on one of the FSU students and proclaims them to be a match. July 24, 1979. Bundy is convicted for the deaths of the Florida State students. After deliberating for less than 7 hours, the jury of 7 men and 5 women find Bundy guilty of first-degree murder of Bowman and Levy and the attempted murders of Kleiner, Chandler and Thomas. The following week, he is sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair. January 7, 1980. Bundy stands trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Brought to Orlando for his second murder trial in a half-year span, Bundy is undone by the testimony of a firefighter who had seen the suspect lead the 12-year-old to his van and the matching clothing fibers found on both the alleged killer and victim. 1 month later, the jury finds Bundy guilty once again. February 9, 1980. Bundy gets married before receiving another death sentence. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy proposes to girlfriend Carol Boone in the presence of a notary public, rendering their marriage legal. Shortly afterward, the jurors recommend the death sentence for the newly married convict. August 17, 1980. Bundy becomes the subject of a popular book. Crime reporter Ann Rule publishes The Stranger Beside Me, her recollections of working alongside Bundy at a suicide crisis hotline in the early 1970s and their evolving friendship as he came to be recognized as a deadly serial killer. The following year, Elizabeth Kendall writes of her own close encounters as Bundy's girlfriend of several years in The Phantom Prince. November 17, 1986. Bundy gets a stay of execution. Just hours before his scheduled execution for killing Leach, Bundy is granted a stay to determine his mental competency during his 1980 trial. 13 months later, a district judge rules that Bundy was fully competent for the trial, calling him a diabolical genius for good measure. January 23, 1989. The killer attempts to atone for his sins. After admitting to numerous murders, including 3 that predate the Northwest spree of 1974, Bundy sits for an interview with evangelist James Dobson and blames his demented behavior on his addictions to alcohol and pornography. That evening the U.S. Supreme Court rejects an emergency stay of execution for the prisoner by a 5-4 vote. January 24, 1989. Bundy is put to death by electrocution. At Florida State Prison, Bundy is strapped into an electric chair nicknamed Old Sparky at around 7 a.m. After telling witnesses to give my love to my family and friends, the notorious killer is declared dead by electrocution at 7:16, drawing cheers from the estimated 200 people gathered outside. Theodore Robert Bundy, née Powell, November 24, 1946 to January 24, 1989, was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped and murdered dozens of young women and girls during the 1970s. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 murders committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. His true victim total is unknown, with Bundy being linked to a disappearance which occurred during his teenage years. Born Theodore Robert Cowell, November 24, 1946. Burlington, Vermont, U.S. Died January 24, 1989, aged 42. Florida State Prison, Rayford, Florida, U.S. Cause of death: execution by electrocution. 5. Other names: Chris Hagen, Kenneth Misner, Officer Roseland, Richard Burden, Rolf Miller. 4. Alma mater: University of Washington, B.A. Spouse: Carol Ann Boone. Bundy's modus operandi typically consisted of simulating having a physical impairment to convince his target that he was in need of assistance or duping her into believing he was an authority figure. He would then lure his victim to a vehicle parked in a more secluded area, at which point he would bludgeon her unconscious, then restrain her with handcuffs before driving his victim to a remote location to be sexually assaulted and killed. Bundy frequently revisited the bodies of those he abducted, grooming and performing sex acts on the corpses until decomposition and destruction by wild animals made further interactions impossible. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping their severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, Bundy broke into homes at night and bludgeoned, maimed, strangled and/or sexually assaulted his victims in their sleep. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before being recaptured in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences in 2 trials, and was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Biographer Ann Rule characterized Bundy as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims, to the point of death and even after. He once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet, which attorney Polly Nelson, a member of his last defense team, agreed. Ted, she wrote, was the very definition of heartless evil. In a letter to Rule, however, he asserted that he never, ever read fact detective magazines, and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. He once told Misha that he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community, late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing, or whatever else could be seen. Psychologist Al Carlisle claimed that Bundy started fantasizing about women he saw while window peeping or elsewhere, the accents of some politicians he listened to on the radio. In essence, he was fantasizing about being someone important. Bundy's childhood Tacoma neighbor, Sandy Holt, described him as a bully and a mean-spirited kid. He liked to terrify people, Holt later said. He liked to be in charge. He liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. She also alleged that Bundy engaged in animal cruelty. He hung one of the stray cats in the neighborhood from one of the clothes lines in the backyard, doused it in lighter fluid and set it on fire, and I heard that cat squealing. She claimed that Bundy would take younger children in the neighborhood into the woods and terrorize them. He'd take them out there and strip them down, take their clothes, she said. You'd hear them screaming for blocks. I mean, no matter where we were here, we could hear them screaming. Added that Bundy built makeshift punji traps around his neighborhood, injuring at least 1 girl. One little girl went over the top of one of Ted's tiger traps and got the whole side of her leg slit open with the sharpened point of the stick that she landed on. Accounts of Bundy's social life also varied. Journalists Michaud and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He also claimed to have no natural sense of how to develop friendships. One didn't know what made people want to be friends, Bundy claimed. I didn't know what underlay social interactions. Some people perceived me as being shy and introverted, he said. I didn't go to dances. I didn't go on the beer-drinking outings. I was a pretty, you might call me straight, but not a social outcast in any way. Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School, however, told Rule that Bundy was well-known and well-liked, there, a medium-sized fish in a large pond. His only significant athletic avocation was downhill skiing, which he pursued enthusiastically with stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, Bundy was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft. When he aged, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington and many other states. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. Shortly thereafter, Edwards ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. Devastated by the breakup, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia and enrolling for one semester at Temple University. It was also at this time in early 1969, Rule believed, that Bundy discovered his true parentage in Vermont. After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound, UPS, for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington, UW, to study Chinese. In 1967 he became romantically involved with a UW classmate. Diane Edwards identified in Bundy biographies by several pseudonyms, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. Bundy later described Edwards as the only woman I ever really loved. In early 1968, Bundy dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington state. Edwards graduated in the spring of 1968 and left Washington for San Francisco. Bundy visited her later that year after he earned a scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford University that summer. Bundy returned to Washington in the fall of 1969, when he met Elizabeth Klopfer, identified in Bundy literature as Meg Anders, Beth Archer or Liz Kendall, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Their tumultuous relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. Bundy became a father figure to Klopfer's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old when he started dating her mother. He remained in her life until she was age 10, after he had been arrested. As an adult, Molly wrote of incidents beginning at age 7 in which Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate with her. Bundy returned to Washington in the fall of 1969, when he met Elizabeth Klopfer, identified in Bundy literature as Meg Anders, Beth Archer or Liz Kendall, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Their tumultuous relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. Bundy became a father figure to Klopfer's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old when he started dating her mother. He remained in her life until she was age 10, after he had been arrested. As an adult, Molly wrote of incidents beginning at age 7 in which Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate with her. Her accounts include Bundy hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her at risk of drowning, indecent exposure and sexual touching disguised as accidents or games. In mid-1970, Bundy, now focused and goal-oriented, re-enrolled at UW, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. There, he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time. She described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. After graduating from UW in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans' opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans's team. Evans subsequently appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee after Evans was re-elected. Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive and a believer in the system. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis and several UW psychology professors. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Edwards. She marveled at his transformation into a serious and dedicated professional, seemingly on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. Bundy continued to date Kloepfer as well. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy matriculated at UPS Law School and continued courting Edwards, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage. At one point he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, Bundy abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, she demanded to know why he had unilaterally ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. 1971 Bundy later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her," but Edwards concluded in retrospect that Ted's high-power courtship in the latter part of 1973 had been deliberately planned, that he had waited all those years to be in a position of where he could make her fall in love with him, so that he could drop her, reject her, as she had rejected him. And by then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely, as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. First murders. There is no consensus as to when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he gave graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. Bundy told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping in Ocean City, New Jersey, in 1969, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philadelphia in 1969. Bundy hinted to homicide detective Robert Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater, but he refused to elaborate. Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. Bundy's earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974, when he was 27. By his own admission, he had by then mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. Murder spree in the western states. Washington, Oregon. Lynn Ann Healy. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about 1 per month. Shortly after midnight on January 4, 1974, around the time that he terminated his relationship with Edwards, Caldwell's in Bundy literature, a dancer and student at UW in Seattle's University District. After bludgeoning Sparks with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries and rupturing her bladder. Sparks remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, and although she survived, she was left with permanent brain damage, with significant loss to her vision and hearing. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and boots, and carried her away. He later stated that he drove Healy to a secluded area, where he raped and murdered her before dumping her body. On March 12, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus but never arrived. Bundy claimed that he burned Manson's skull in his girlfriend's fireplace, down to the last ash, in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness. On April 17, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rincourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room at evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellersburg, 110 miles southeast of Seattle. Washington students later came forward to report encounter. 2 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rincourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier with a man wearing a sling, who was asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, age 22, left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 260 miles south of Seattle, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Bundy claimed that he spotted Parks in the cafeteria and persuaded her to go with him to a bar. After they got into his car, he tied and gagged Parks and drove her back to Washington to be killed, raping her twice on the way. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot, talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. Bundy later stated he brought Ball back to his residence where they had a consensual, sexual encounter before he strangled her while she was sleeping, although this failed to explain the damage done to her skull. Investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from similar appearance: young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. 18-year-old UW student Jorgen Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Bundy later told Keppel that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle. Investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from similar appearance: young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. In the early hours of June 11, 18-year-old UW student Jorgen Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Bundy later told Keppel that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. The next afternoon he returned to the UW alley and, in the very midst of a major crime scene investigation, located and gathered Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot and departed, unobserved. It was a feat so brazen, wrote Keppel, that it astonishes police even today. Bundy said he revisited Hawkins' corpse on 3 occasions. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man on crutches, with a leg cast and carrying a briefcase, in an alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night of her disappearance. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a PAM for women on rape prevention. Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At the day he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone, 1947 to 2018, a twice-divorced mother of 2 who would play an important role in the final phase of his life 6 years later. Bundy's 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, in which he committed many of his crimes. The vehicle was on display at the now-defunct National Museum of Crime and Punishment Dog and is now at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the scarcity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police would not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, and were within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared. And at many crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Washington and Oregon murders culminated on July 14 with the abductions in broad daylight of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. 4 fernal witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw Ted approach Janice Anod, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the scarcity of physical evidence severely hampered them. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared. And at many crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Washington and Oregon murders culminated on July 14th with the abductions in broad daylight of two women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw Ted approach Janice Anand, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company about 4 hours later. Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the scarcity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Janice Anand, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company about 4 hours later. Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy told Stephen Michaud and FBI agent William Hagmeyer that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslund and that he forced one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other, but he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Klopfer, Rule, a day employee and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives who were receiving up to 200 tips per day thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. On September 6th, 2 grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Ott and Naslund near a service road in Issaquah, 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rincourt, Parks and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked, just east of Issaquah. Manson's remains were never recovered. Idaho, Utah, Colorado. Rooming house in Salt Lake City where Bundy lived from September 1974 to October 1975, showing the fire escape used to sneak into his room and windows to the utility room where he concealed photo souvenirs of his murders in August 1974. Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. While he called Klopfer often, he dated at least a dozen other women as he studied the first-year law curriculum a second time. Bundy was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. It was a great disappointment to me, he said. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to Tam Thorntley before execution. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Duranch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland, of the Murray Police Department and told Duranch that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When Duranch pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Duranch was able to open the car door and escape later that evening. Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theater production at the school to pick up her brother. 1350 The school's drama teacher and a student told police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Duranch's wrist. Bundy eventually admitted to abducting Kent and keeping her at his apartment for a day, stating she was alive during half of it. In November, Klopfer called King County Police a second time after reading that young women were disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. Detective Randy Hergesheimer of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, but the Lake Sammamish witness considered most reliable by detectives failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Klopfer called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at that time no credible forensic evidence linked him to the Utah murders. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Klopfer, who did not tell him that she had reported him to police on 3 occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. Karen Campbell, Bundy's 14th documented murder victim and the subject of his first homicide indictment. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward, from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January 12, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn, now the Wildwood Lodge, in Snowmass Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. According to the coroner's report, she had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear groove depressions on her skull. Her assailant had slit her left earlobe and her body also bore deep cuts from. On March 15, 100 miles northeast of Snowmass Village, Vail ski instructor Julie Lyle Cunningham, age 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her before sexually assaulting her at a secondary site near Rifle, 90 miles west of Vail. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Oliverson, age 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6 while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. Bundy stated he abducted Oliverson, killed her in his car near the Utah state line, and dumped her body in the Colorado River. This admission was supported by gas receipts, which showed that he was in the city on the same day that Oliverson went missing. On May 6, Bundy parked outside of the Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City, and after seeing 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver walking along by herself, he lured her into his vehicle before driving her to his Holiday Inn hotel room. He then raped Culver and drowned her in the bathtub. He disposed of her body in the Snake River north of Pocatello. Bundy reportedly provided intimate details about Lynette's personal life in his confession. Campbell disappeared while walking down this brightly lit hallway to her hotel room. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State Day co-workers, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. He subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Klopfer in early June and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Klopfer made no mention of her multiple discussions with authorities in King County and Salt Lake County. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student, known in various accounts as either Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer. On June 28, 15-year-old Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her murder became Bundy's last confession, tape-recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of victims Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Campbell disappeared while walking down this brightly lit hallway to her hotel room. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State Day co-workers, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. He subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Klopfer in early June and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Klopfer made no mention of her multiple discussions with authorities in King County and Salt Lake County. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student, known in various accounts as either Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer. On June 28, 15-year-old Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her murder became Bundy's last confession, tape-recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of victims Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver and Curtis were never recovered. In August 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints LDS Church. Although he was not an active participant in services and ignored most church restrictions, he would later be excommunicated by the LDS Church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked his religious preference after his arrest, Bundy answered, Methodist, the religion of his childhood. In Washington state, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it had begun. In an effort to make sense of an overwhelming mass of data, they resorted to the then innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County Payroll Computer, a huge, primitive machine, by contemporary standards, but the only one available for their use. After inputting the many lists they had compiled classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named, Ted, known sex offenders and so on, they queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was, literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from Utah of his arrest. Arrest and first trial. Items found in Bundy's Volkswagen, Utah, 1975. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, another Salt Lake City suburb. Hayward observed Bundy cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours, and fleeing at high speed after seeing the patrol car. He noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats, and searched the car. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 Durange kidnapping, and Bundy's name from Klopfer's phone call a month later. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Kent had disappeared. Police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Bundy, so he was released on his own recognizance. He later said that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Klopfer. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Bundy was perpetually in debt, and Klopfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, 3 break your effing neck," she said. Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He kept a lug wrench, taped halfway up the handle, in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed, for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Auden Naslund were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Klopfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney, and learned of the existence of Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands, microscopic microscopically indistinguishable from those of Smith and Durange. A coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a photo lineup. Durange immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Kent, whose body had not yet been found, but more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DA Ranch case. Bundy was freed on $15,000, paid by his parents, and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Clover's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, Bundy was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January. Pitkin County Courthouse, where Bundy jumped from the second window from the left, second story to escape on June 7, 1977. Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and as such was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, Bundy limped through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, Bundy left the cabin and continued south toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, Bundy broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food and a ski parka. However, instead of continuing southward, he walked back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of an Aspen golf course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Bundy drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Campbell's body. As his own attorney, Bundy had rights of discovery indicating that his escape had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pretrial motions consistently resolved in his favor and significant bits of evidence were ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With as little as a year and a half to serve on the Durange conviction, had Ted persevered, he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period by visitors, Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, Bundy sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling. Having lost 35 pounds, he was able to wriggle through and explore the crawl space above. In the weeks that followed, multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in the small town of Aspen, and Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles 97 kilometers to the east. From there he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy entered FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m. he bludgeoned Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, aged 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples, bit deeply into her left buttock and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom he attacked Kathy Kleiner, aged 21, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder. And Karen Chandler, aged 21, who suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth and a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the attack. Kleiner attributed their survival to automobile headlights illuminating the interior of their room and frightening away the attacker. Tallahassee detectives determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing after leaving the sorority house. Bundy broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked 21-year-old FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness in her left ear and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On Thomas's bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs, similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic. Kimberly Leach. On February 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burden, Fire Department, but retreated when Parmenter's older brother arrived and confronted him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. Forensic experts surmised that Leach had been raped before having her throat cut and her genitals mutilated with a knife on February 12th. With insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line. After a wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen when told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gut before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students. Stolen credit cards and a stolen television set also found were a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burden, Fire Department, in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." Subsequent trials, marriage. Bundy departing a preliminary hearing, Miami, 1979. Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys. Bundy again handled much of his own defense. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, Nelson later wrote. Ted was facing murder charges, with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was that he be in charge according to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of the defense team. A pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman and Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were amenable to a deal, by one account, because prospects of losing at trial were very good. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea bargain not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a tactical move. He could enter his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost and for witnesses to die, move on or retract their testimony. Once the case against him had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. It made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty, Minerva said. He just couldn't do it. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving the house clutching the murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included impressions of the bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Levy's left buttock, which forensic odontologists Richard Subirin and Lowell Levine matched to castings of Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting Bundy on July 24, 1979, of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Coward imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again, after less than 8 hours deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence included clothing fibers with an unusual manufacturing error, found in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the Leach trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court, in the presence of a judge, constituted a legal marriage. As he was questioning Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness, he asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a 3rd time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This 3rd death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. On October 24, 1982, Boone gave birth to a daughter, Rose Bundy. While conjugal visits were not allowed at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, where Bundy was incarcerated, inmates were known to pool their money in order to bribe guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. Death row. Confessions and execution. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. Speaking mostly in 3rd person to avoid the stigma of confession, he began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and thought processes. Bundy recounted his career as a thief, confirming Cloakford's longtime suspicion that he had shoplifted virtually everything of substance that he owned. "The big payoff for me," he said, "was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and taken. Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault," he said, "fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims." Bundy told Hagmiller that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in his early years, before moving into what he termed his prime, or predator, phase at about the time of Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that he began killing well before, although he never explicitly admitted having done so. "They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you too are forever one, and the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them." Bundy told Hagmiller that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in his early years, before moving into what he termed his prime, or predator, phase at about the time of Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that he began killing well before, although he never explicitly admitted having done so. In July 1984, prison guards found 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Bundy's cell. A steel bar in one of the cell's windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror, and Bundy was moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with another high-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr. In October 1984, Bundy contacted Keppel and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Green River Task Force Detective Dave Reichert interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for a further 17 years. Keppel published a detailed documentation of the Green River interviews, and later collaborated with Michaud on another examination of the interview material. In early 1986, an execution date March 4th was set on the Chi Omega convictions. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date, July 2nd, was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmeyer and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He told them that he revisited Taylor Mountain, Issaquah and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Smith's lifeless face and repeatedly washed Amy's hair. "If you've got time," he told Hagmeyer, "they can be anything you want them to be." Bundy decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw, and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably the 4 later found on Taylor Mountain, Rincourt, Parks, Ball and Healy, in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2nd execution. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely and remanded the Chi Omega case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and an erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase, requiring the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalties, which, ultimately, were never resolved. A new date, November 18th, was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November 17th. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling over the dissents of Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan, Jr. Within hours of that final denial, a firm execution date of January 24, 1989, was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeals courts had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could, even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics. Though people everywhere seethed at the apparent delay in executing the archdemon, Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track. With all appeal avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon whom he declined to identify if indeed he ever knew their identities. He said he left a 5th corpse, Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Cloakford's fireplace. He described the Issaquah crime scene where the bones of Ott, Naslund and Hawkins were found, and it was almost like he was just there, Keppel said. Like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time. Nelsori's impressions were similar. It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me, she wrote, his manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho, Utah and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. He explained that when he was in Utah he could bring his victims back to his apartment, where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines. The new ulterior strategy quickly became apparent. He withheld many details, hoping to parlay the incomplete information into yet another stay of execution. There are other buried remains in Colorado, he admitted, but refused to elaborate the new strategy immediately dubbed Ted's Bones for Time scheme served only to deepen the resolve of authorities to see Bundy executed on schedule. and yielded little new detailed information. In cases where he did give details, nothing was found. Colorado Detective Matt Lindville interpreted this as a conflict between his desire to postpone his execution by divulging information and his need to remain in total possession, the only person who knew his victims' true resting places. When it became clear that no further stays would be forthcoming from the courts, Bundy supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option, executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last purported love interest, asked the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal more information. All refused. The families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them, wrote Nelson. They didn't need his confession. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to further delays in any case. We are not going to have the system manipulated, he told reporters. For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was, in fact, guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone call on the morning of his execution. She was hurt by his relationship with Diana Weiner, Nelson wrote, and devastated by his sudden wholesale confessions in his last days. Hagmiller was present during Bundy's final interviews with investigators. On the eve of his execution, he talked of suicide. He did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die. Hagmiller said Bundy was executed in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16 a.m. EST on Tuesday, January 24, 1989. His last words were directed at his attorney Jim Coleman and Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends. Hundreds of revelers sang, danced and set off fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out, then cheered as the white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. He was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington state, in accordance with his will. Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was, in fact, guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter. Bundy was an unusually organized and calculating criminal who used his extensive knowledge of law enforcement methodologies to elude identification and capture for years. His crime scenes were distributed over large geographic areas. His victim count had risen to at least 20 before it became clear that numerous investigators in widely disparate jurisdictions were hunting the same man. Bundy's assault methods of choice were blunt trauma and strangulation, two relatively silent techniques that could be accomplished with common household items. He deliberately avoided firearms due to the noise they made and the ballistic evidence they left behind. He was a meticulous researcher who explored his surroundings in minute detail, looking for safe sites to seize and dispose of victims. He was unusually skilled at minimizing physical evidence. Bundy's fingerprints were never found at a crime scene, nor any other incontrovertible evidence of his guilt, a fact he repeated often during the years in which he attempted to maintain his innocence. Other significant obstacles for law enforcement were Bundy's generic, essentially anonymous physical features, and a curious chameleon-like ability to change his appearance. Early on, police complained of the futility of showing his photograph to witnesses. He looked different in virtually every photo ever taken of him. In person, his expression would so change his whole appearance that there were moments that you weren't even sure you were looking at the same person, said Stuart Hansen Jr., the judge in the Durange trial. He was really a changeling. Bundy was well aware of this unusual quality and he exploited it, using subtle modifications of facial hair or hairstyle to significantly alter his appearance as necessary. He concealed his one distinctive identifying mark, a dark mole on his neck. With turtleneck shirts and sweaters, even his Volkswagen Beetle proved difficult to pin down. Its color was variously described by witnesses as metallic or non-metallic, tan or bronze, light brown or dark brown. Bundy's modus operandi evolved in organization and sophistication over time, as is typical of serial killers, according to FBI experts. Early on, it consisted of forcible late-night entry followed by a violent attack with a blunt weapon on a sleeping victim. As his methodology evolved, he became progressively more organized in his choice of victims and crime scenes. He would employ various ruses designed to lure his victim to the vicinity of his vehicle where he had pre-positioned a weapon, usually a crowbar. In many cases he wore a plaster cast on one leg or a sling on one arm, and sometimes hobbled on crutches, then requested assistance in carrying something to his vehicle. Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic, traits he exploited to win the confidence of his victims and the people around him in his daily life. Ted lured females, Michaud wrote. The way a lifeless silk flower can dupe a honeybee, he would sometimes approach Fernals pretending to be an authority figure or firefighter. Once Bundy had victims near or inside his vehicle, he would overpower and bludgeon them and then restrain them with handcuffs. He would then transport them to a pre-selected secondary site, often a considerable distance away, and rape them during ligature strangulation. In the case of his Utah victims, the secondary site would be his apartment building. Toward the end of his spree, in Florida, perhaps under the stress of being a fugitive, he regressed to indiscriminate attacks on sleeping women. While he is often said to have been a torturer, and biographer Anne Rule in particular regarded him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure in human suffering, Bundy disputed these claims in one of his conversations with Michaud, insisting that he never deliberately tortured any of those he killed and that the murders had no sadistic focus on enjoyment derived from the infliction of pain and injury. To the contrary, he claimed that he went out of his way to mitigate his victims' physical torment, although he also told Hagmeyer that he would pose his victims to recreate Detective magazine covers at secondary sites. Bundy would remove and later burn the victims' clothing, or in at least one case Cunningham's deposit them in a Goodwill Industries collection bin. He explained that the clothing removal was ritualistic, but also a practical matter, as it minimized the chance of leaving trace evidence at the crime scene that could implicate him. A manufacturing error in fibers from his own clothing, ironically, provided a crucial incriminating link to Leach killing. He often revisited his secondary crime scenes to engage in acts of necrophilia, and to groom or dress up the cadavers. Some victims were found wearing articles of clothing they had never worn, or nail polish that family members had never seen. Bundy took Polaroid photos of many of his victims. When you work hard to do something right, he told Hagmeyer, you don't want to forget it. Consumption of large quantities of alcohol was an essential component, he told both Keppel and Michaud. He needed to be extremely drunk while on the prowl in order to significantly diminish his inhibitions and to sedate the dominant personality that he feared might prevent his inner entity from acting on his impulses. All of Bundy's known victims were white females, most of middle class backgrounds. Almost all were between the ages of 15 and 25 and most were college students. He apparently never approached anyone he might have met before. In their last conversation before his execution, Bundy told Kloepfer he had purposely stayed away from her when he felt the power of his sickness building in him. Rule noted that most of the identified victims had long straight hair, parted in the middle like Edwards, the woman who rejected him, and to whom he later became engaged and then rejected in return. As you leave the page, don't forget to hit the like bell and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so as yet. Thank you for watching.